So welcome everybody. Welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar today, Optimising Director Succession Planning with Skills Matrices. Today we are having a discussion with our special guest, Danica McLean, Managing Director of Board Administration Services, Stephen Bowman and Simon Telfer, Managing Director of Appoint Better Boards. My name is Sean McDonald and I shall be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thank you for attending. We always appreciate the effort you guys make to be here for our live events and during the session. If you have any questions for our panel, please use the Q&A button on your toolbar as against the chat. It's just easier for us to get through them and to identify the questions. And finally, if you stay through to the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a really short 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those not too familiar with Board Pro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, and we serve around 32,000 users and across 29 different countries. We enable organisations effectively to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively with, you guessed it, clever software from Board Pro, with less time and deliver more impact and value for the organisation. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organisations, especially those with resource constraints. These free webinars and the many templates, guides and white papers on the Board Pro resource page are a great tangible example of how we look to achieve our mission for non-profits and small business entities around the world. So for the next 45 odd minutes to be precise, just relax, listen and add to the discussion by asking as many questions as you would like. A full recording of the webinar along with the slide deck and the skills matrix, which we will talk about during the webinar, will be provided within about 24 hours of this session. So let me now hand over to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Danica McLean. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. As Sean kindly said, my name's Danica McLean and I'm the Managing Director of Board Administration Services, which is a company that provides bespoke governance support to boards and trusts in any of that administrative function that they might need, from minute taking through to the end-to-end running of their meetings and helping to create supporting governance documents.
Thanks, Danica. And Stephen?
Hi everyone, Steve Bowman from Conscious Governance. I've been the CEO of quite a number of non-profit, reasonably large ones, both here and also overseas. And then the last 30 years have actually been working with boards and CEOs, particularly around either strategic planning or governance and board reviews. So that's most of what we do. And one of the things I love about doing these sessions with Danica and Simon and the others is that we get to share information that we learn from other boards that they found worked really well for them. So I look forward to sharing that as we go on. Simon.
Good, okay, thanks, Steve. I do a lot of board recruitment. I've placed over 200 directors into businesses and not-for-profits throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I also set up a community called Appoint Better Boards, which has about 25,000 members. So if you're looking for board roles in New Zealand, join Appoint Better Boards. We're advertising about 30 roles every month or so. With my board recruitment, I've worked a lot with skills matrices and looking forward to contributing today. So Danica, let's kick off.
Let's go. So thank you everyone for attending today. Appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. We're going to cover off skills matrices and the vital role that they play in ensuring that your board is well prepared for the future. So namely in identifying gaps that will guide your director succession planning. We'll also just touch on best practices of using a skills matrix and any pitfalls that you might want to avoid. So why is succession planning critical? The reasons why are to prepare your board for the future. So it should be tied into your strategy, and to be able to identify gaps where your board might be lacking in expertise, where you can target that in your director recruitment processes to bring in a better fit for purpose board to help guide you in those long-term goals and objectives. You can go to the next slide there, Sean.
Thank you.
So when you are director succession planning, you want to find the right skills and competencies. And I think a lot of companies naturally look to find people with expertise within that business and within that market. So it's really about understanding where the other gaps are in ideal board compositions, looking not just at those technical skills, but wider governance skills, as well as balancing that with soft skills and diversity. So having an understanding of what actually is going to work for your company to fit those strategic goals, and what looks good in terms of best practice and governance. Steve or Simon, did you want to add anything more to that in terms of what you're looking for when you're running these processes?
If I kick off with that one, I think one of the things, particularly in those organisations where they are looking for directors from amongst their members, for example. So if you're a member-based organisation in particular, what a skills matrix does is give some guidance to your members about, if they've got these sorts of skills, put your hand up. Yeah, be part of the leadership, be part of the creation of the future, because in many member-based organisations, a lot of members don't even think about coming onto the board, or if they do, maybe it's for the wrong reasons. But if you actually identify, here are some of the skills that we'd like around the board. We've got some independent positions as well too, but here are the skills particularly we're interested in. Now, any of you as members can put your hands up, but in particular, we'd welcome you to consider putting your name forward to be to go through the election process if you have some of these skills, because they're going to really help us. So I think that sort of optics and messaging around the skills matrix shouldn't just be about the board going out and seeking, or Simon and his team going out and finding, but also, if you're a member-based organisation, giving some guidance to the members about what would be actually really useful.
Nice. So I'll just remind everyone, if you have a question, pop it in the Q&A. A wise person said to me, a mentor of mine in my governance career many years ago, said, make sure you build your board for tomorrow, not for today. And I think that succession planning around that skills matrix is really important. It's not looking just at the here and now. It's looking about tomorrow, and tomorrow is what's happening next year and what's happening the year after that and the year after that. So linking your strategy, and when you're doing your forward analysis and you're doing all that opportunities and threats side of things, you're reflecting that in your skills matrix as well. It's always the chair's responsibility to help drive succession planning and keep that matrix up to date. And I always find it always lands on the important but never urgent side of a chair's responsibility. So, and I say that because when people are looking for board roles, and I know this isn't a board recruitment webinar, but they're sort of related around succession planning. I'm saying, look, if you reach out to a chair and you want to have a coffee and share insights about what's happening in the sector, and asking them about their succession, the chair will actually be quite happy, because it allows them to sort of tick the box for going, I've done something about succession planning this month. So it's one of those things there that it's the chair's responsibility. And it has to be a really proactive approach there, because it can easily go 12 months without seriously thinking about the board and how it's going to be built over coming years.
Interesting point, Simon, in terms of being the chair's responsibility. What I'm starting to see boards do now is actually move it away from the chair being the custodian of that, and actually putting it into their people, culture, nominations committee, or their governance committee, whatever it might be. And the other trend that I'm starting to see is that the chairs typically don't sit on those committees either these days. I used to say the chair of the board should be the chair of the governance committee, and then I've actually done a 180-degree flip on that now. But one of the things always is just be aware that if you leave it up to any one person, it's always a bit of a hit and a miss. But if you give it a house to live in, a home to live in, for example, a board committee, then it's more likely to get done because it is part of the collective there. Chair typically is the public spokesperson for those sorts of things. But I think just a consideration I've seen some boards doing now is to actually drive it. It's now becoming more and more seen as a function of the people, cultures, nominations, remuneration sort of committee thing.
Yeah. And it's a very fair point. If your board is large enough, the organisation is large enough to have that committee structure, which in a lot of privately owned business boards that I work with, it isn't as formalised as that. But it's a fair point. Danica, we've got a question here. Would you like me to answer that, or would you like to flip to the next slide first?
No, we can go for the question.
Well, I'm interested in, and this is a great one from Manu, so thank you, Manu, for this, is in some not-for-profit board members don't have a term. Some not-for-profit board members don't have a term, but stay on until they decide to leave. What's your view on term limits, board terms or not? Danica, you have a view around that?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge because you want that continuity of experience, but you need to balance that at some point with bringing in a fresh perspective or changing up that balance if your strategy is changing. Like if you've got a great board with lots of experience and they've been there for a long time, but you've decided to have a digital transformation, you might be lacking that kind of digital experience or transformation experience, and that might be the trigger point where you decide that you're going to bring on fresh perspective or fresh expertise. Yeah, what do you think there?
Steve, what's yours?
I'm going to say something that some people may not like, but if you don't have term limits, to me, it's a sign of laziness and mediocrity. And the reason I say that is because if the organisations that don't have term limits really don't take succession planning seriously. So what's happening now is that you'll find that boards are looking at typically 3 by 3 by 3 years, followed by another 2 terms of 3 years, and then you must step off the board for 12 months. Then after that, if you're still interested, you can go and put yourself forward for another one. But what that does is it forces the board to actually look at succession planning, and the directors that we need in 3 years may be a different skill set than what we need at the moment. There's 2 elements of that. Number one is the board should actually help their directors upskill so they can be that director that they're going to need in 3 years' time, or they should also start looking either through their board committee structure or through other structures they've got who might be actually suitable to step into something in 2 or 3 years' time. So there's always the argument that you don't want to lose the good ones. Well, you never lose the good ones. They may not be on the board, but you set up another mechanism to actually tap into them. So the boards that don't have term limits, typically it's because they haven't thought about them, or even worse, it's so hard to get a good director. We want to keep them for as long as we can. We're quite happy to wheel them out at the end.
Yeah. And look, and the greatest thing about term limits is it allows, it provides a trigger and a break to have a sensible conversation. And in the absence of that, then it can get to that point that Joan's been on the board for 7 years and no one really wants to have that conversation, and then it becomes awkward and it doesn't need to be. So I do agree wholeheartedly with the 3 by 3 by 3 approach, and having, no matter how great or how invested or how competent the director is or the board member is, that at that 3 year there is a conscious conversation about another term. Danica, let's flip the slide if you like, because I have another question too, but we'll keep moving.
Just, Simon, before we move off on that one, just for people who are listening to this, what I've sometimes found is in member-based organisations where you've got a natural membership and that comes from, that they are quite happy having 2 by 2 by 2 because that moves more members through the leadership structure. And that I only found out about this a couple of years ago, and I thought that sort of makes sense as well too, so that if you actually want your members involved in the leadership and the creation of the future and to give them that sort of pathway, a 2 by 2 by 2 is quite a good structure as well. Simon.
I'm going to wait. Danica, let's kick on. And then I've got a couple of really good questions from Patrick and Jane about the chair not being the chair of the nominations committee. If you've got any other questions, throw it in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, that brings us to what is a skills matrix. A skills matrix is literally an assessment of all directors' skills and you create a matrix to act as a visual aid in identifying the gaps where your board might need more expertise. So you would take, as you can see here in the example, you've got the directors along the top, and then down the left-hand side, you've got the skills listed out, both hard skills and soft skills, and then you might put in your diversity questions as well. And then in the gaps in between, you will correlate what the director's skills are. You can use either a tick, yes, they have that skill, or you can actually have like a grading system and say they've got low skills, medium skills, or high skills in those areas. And it creates a visual matrix, and where you see those gaps gives you the very clear position of where your gaps are in the expertise in the board.
I've got a question for you guys, because I think the tick, non-tick is quite binary. Have you got the skill or don't you have the skill? I think so. The graduated one, maybe 1 to 5. How do you find, when I've been doing this, and I think of a national sporting organisation I did it for, and the board was slightly dysfunctional, not particularly capable, but when they did self-assessment, they gave themselves 4 and 5s, and they gave their colleagues 4s and 5s when objectively you just could not give that. So, but then organisations don't have possibly the resources to bring in someone like me or Steve or Danica to come and actually objectively do that. So how do you get that balance when the moderation is not there and the skills are not, the level of competency is not objectively matched to the number that's been given?
We have a couple of questions around the template. Now, incidentally, this great template was provided to us, or has been provided to us, by Conscious Governance, Stephen Bowman's template. So this will be available to you after the webinar. We will send it to you via email.
Yeah, you don't need to read it on screen. Just know that's sort of the idea behind it. Look, there's a couple of things, Simon. You've raised the absolutely critical point here of what happens if people either under or over rate themselves, and it happens all the time. And you mentioned sporting organisations. I've done these with most of Australia's major Olympic sports. Guess what? They do exactly the same thing. So one of the things we've found really useful is to actually have the chair and one of the other directors be the moderators, so that you get each of the directors to rate themselves, but then it goes through a little subcommittee, usually of the chair and one other, and get them to moderate the self-moderation. Sometimes you can bring in an external person, but they're not going to know the people as much. But the notion of moderation, I learnt very early on in the piece that the last thing you want to do is to get an external person to rate the directors. I did that a couple of times and everyone hated it. So if you do have someone, if you do get directors self-rating themselves, then make sure there's a proper moderation process in place. The issue becomes is if the chair has no idea either, and they're all just being polite.
Yeah.
Back to you, Danica.
I was just going to say, you can also include some of the key executives in that skills matrix as well, to have their skills there too, because they might be able to provide some of that industry insight that the board doesn't necessarily need to have if you've got plenty of that. So yeah, the skills matrix is really a snapshot of your board's current capability, as well as a blueprint for where you need to go next.
I've seen some boards where they actually provide quite extensive descriptions of what they mean by the skills and give examples of it. And I think that's quite a good idea, but please don't attach it to the skills matrix, because it makes it a 40-page document then, rather than something that's actually simple and useful.
Yeah. Just before we move on, Danica, just a quick one. Sujan or Nathan, you asked what does 3x3x3, and good point, it's not some football formation on the pitch. What we're saying there is typically with term limits, you are appointed for 3 years, and then there's a right of renewal for another 3 years, and there's a right of appointment for another 3 years. And sometimes people put term limits saying you will not be able to, directors or board members will not be able to serve more than 3 consecutive terms, 3x3x3 being 9, and 2 is like, so hopefully that understands it's that point where their term is up, but they're eligible to get reappointed for a second and possibly a third term.
I'd just add to that, eligible to be re-elected.
Yeah.
It's not automatic, and the trouble with a lot of boards is that when they got the term limits in place, people think it's an automatic rollover, and it shouldn't be. It should be an actual election process again. But they're eligible for that, and after their 9 years, they're not eligible.
Back to you, Danica.
Thanks, Sean. Can you just go back a slide? I just want to
Sure
touch
thing.
on what those kind of key components are that you want to see in a skills matrix. So these should generally be tailored to your organisation. There's not a one piece fits all solution, because it does need to match your own company and your own board and what your objectives are. So generally you'd see those key skills that you look for in a good director, management experience, financial understanding, governance experience. You definitely include industry experience and what it is that your company is. And then you want to bring in those soft skills, leadership, communication, teamwork, because those are considered just as effective in good board dynamics. And then again, there's those diversity factors, and that's not necessarily just ethnic diversity or sex diversity. That's a kind of diversity of thought, what your kind of different thinking patterns are or backgrounds.
I think sometimes when people do skills matrices, and I have it, they push back and say, but is that a skill, or is that experience, or is that knowledge? I wouldn't get too hung up about that. It's you don't have to specifically define it. It's what's really important for you to have a board that has the knowledge and experience and wisdom and collectively has what it takes for this organisation to go from where it is now to where it plans to be in 3 years. So don't get too hung up on, is it a skill, is it experience, or is it knowledge?
I think you really want to tie it to where the organisation is going. So having that clear strategy to be able to identify the future gaps that you might not have.
I think the other thing too, Danica, it's a great segue for the board to have a conversation about, are we a board that is here to create the future, or are we a board that's representing all the sectors of our sector? And the issue that you often have, and this is why sometimes you'll find 10, 12, 14 people sitting around a board table, is because they want to slice and dice the notion of representation. And just something for people to remember, your board directors cannot be representatives. It's illegal to act on behalf of others. You have to act in the best interests of the organisation. So therefore, it raises the great conversation. We've got to be careful we don't fall in the trap of trying to get a whole lot of representation around our board, and lose sight of the fact of the board is that they are there to actually make the choices that create the future for the communities that we serve. And to do that, we need great diversity, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that we have to be representative.
Danica, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I think we can probably skip this slide because we've answered a lot of these questions already. So again, we've kind of touched on this in terms of how you assess the board composition through, I think we've established that self-assessment is the best way to do it, and to have that objective overview from a separate group that look at how people have assessed and just kind of put their own assessment against that to make sure that it is actually what they're saying it is. So we're kind of going to get to now how we use this for succession planning. So we've touched on prioritising the skills that you've identified through those gaps for new appointments. I think that next point there, creating a pipeline, Simon, you kind of touched on that when you talked about approaching a chair to share market insights and potentially expressing your interest for joining a board. Having a pipeline can be really valuable in your succession planning. So especially I think in a member organisation like Stephen's touched on, proactively assessing people that have those skills and assessing their appetite for joining the board, and having that pool of people that you might be able to count on if there is a unexpected retirement or someone has to step down, as well as for that succession planning in the future, knowing that you have that expertise available. And knowing that you don't, that's where you go out to recruitment with those specific experiences needed. Simon, how have you seen these used in director appointments? Do you find that people generally can fit the bill for all of the experience asked, or is it just kind of a pick and choose of some different pieces of experience?
Well, it's pointless doing a board exercise, having a skills matrix, and then doing a board recruitment process that's completely tangential to that. Doesn't make sense at all. You need to look at where the gaps are, but then you need to prioritize those gaps, and also need to make sure you're not looking for Superman or Superwoman around that. So you sort of have to be. It's all about making decisions and that prioritization. So I think that's probably the key thing that I take away from that. And you see some things that are quite linked together, like, it's a bit difficult if you're really weak and you need someone in the risk area, and you're also really weak in the strategy area, and you're wanting someone who's really good at strategy and really good at risk. So there has to sort of be a link between the skills that you're trying to fill on the matrix and what you would typically find in an individual.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say, Johnny, what I found with a lot of organisations is where they get the most value out of their skills matrix is where they advertise, is where they actually tell people these are the skills where, rather than hiding it behind closed doors and going and just tapping people on the shoulders, but actually putting it out there. These are the skills in particular. And what I've seen a lot of organisations, both corporate and not-for-profit, do is that they actually advertise for directors with the actual skills that they're looking for. And, 2 times out of 3, they don't get much, but that 1 time out of 3, they get someone that just came out of the woodwork they didn't even know existed that were absolutely brilliant for them. So don't hide this. My view on this would be to make it public in ways that are appropriate, saying these are the skills in particular that we're looking for.
And I think as well, if you identify a gap amongst all board members, it's a really good tool for finding training opportunities for your directors. So if it's apparent that there's no experience whatsoever in the board and cybersecurity, for example, then you might use that to trigger arranging someone to come in and do a training exercise for all of the directors on that topic.
Just jump in a couple of questions here, and I'll just remind everyone, rather than putting it in the chat, because the chat's really busy, if you put it in the Q&A. And Steve, just really quickly, a couple of people, both Jane and Patrick, have asked why you made that comment that the chair of the board should not chair the nominations or the governance committee.
Yeah, so chairs of the board are busy. Please don't put them on a whole stack of committees as well. That's why the notion of having an ex officio, I can attend any committee meeting if I like and I'm supposed to sit on, is a nonsense. And sorry if I'm being a bit blunt here, but I just see it happening time and time again. So the chair of the board manages the work of the board. They've really got their chairing job. The role of your governance committee or your nominations, succession planning committee, whatever you might call it, is to look after the high performance talent of the organisation, which is both the board itself and also the CEO. It should be made up of a couple of directors and probably a couple of outside people also that are very, very skilled at high performance management at that level. So not HR people, we're talking about people that are skilled at actually working with CEOs to help develop them, working with boards to ensure that we're getting the most out of our board. And so therefore the chair in that is going to be part of the conversation when it comes to developing, but someone's got to do the work. Please don't make the chair do the work. They're flat out as it is. So that's my view. Simon.
Danica, have you got time for one more question? Or I've got a question for you. Do you think that culture should be captured as a specific component of a skills matrix?
Do you mean company culture, or do you think they mean racial culture?
No, I think company culture.
I mean, that's an interesting skill to assess.
Yeah.
I think if you're looking for someone in HR that's championed a company culture review, that might be helpful, but I'm not quite sure how you'd identify that in amongst directors.
Yeah. I think when you're talking, look, I think the culture is a collective of the organisation, not just something that you sort of go, oh, great, we've got to tick on a box for that part of the culture in the skills matrix. I don't think it's quite as quite like that. But what you might say is that as a board, we feel that our board dynamic is less risk-taking and is too conservative. And so while you might frame that as culture, but what you're actually saying is that the type of personality or the type of energy or the type of way of thinking that we're looking for is more on that side, more right brain than left brain on that side of things. So I think that's where you look at it as far as a board dynamic, as opposed to thinking a skills matrix will really be a big movement for addressing organisational culture. Got a couple more questions. Sean, can you just yell out whether you want to start a question or to move on, since you're...
I think we should move on and have a look at the
Okay.
questions at the end, Simon.
Okay. We can go to the next slide, thank you. So common pitfalls and how to avoid them. I think we've touched on that overemphasis on technical skills, so focusing too much on industry experience or a finance background or a legal background without balancing that out with the soft skills that help to kind of contribute to a better operating board, better company culture, better board culture, and that diversity, to bring in diversity of thought and to avoid some of those unconscious biases and groupthink that can come in when you have too homogenous a board. Another pitfall can be not communicating properly the purpose of this assessment and doing a skills assessment to form a skills matrix. And some directors can be quite defensive because they don't understand the process and feel like it's coming as a little bit of an attack, or you might be planning to kick some people off the board at the end of their terms because you're looking for areas that you can bring in new directors. So I think communication is very important. You need to bring the board on the journey when you're doing these skills assessments and creating a skills matrix. So best practice, we've touched on this at the very beginning but didn't really answer it. I think once you've done the skills matrix and you've done that initial assessment, you need to keep it as a rolling document. So it does need to be constantly updated. I think, in my view, ideally, you would have it as a standing agenda item every year to be reviewed, just to have a little bit of a run through on that self-assessment of the skills, but also to realign it to the strategy to identify if there are any new skills that you want to be targeting. The board evaluation is a very good way to tie in that matrix. It's a good time to do the review. If you're doing an annual board evaluation, then it's quite easy to just do a self-review of the skills matrix at the same time. And again, ensuring that board members are on that journey and they're aware of the skills matrix and its role in the succession planning.
The thing I'd say there, Danica, is that what I find mostly that boards don't do as well as they could is to actually continually review their strategic plan and what might we need in a year or 2 years' time. Simon's point right at the very start there. And so when I see a lot of boards, they use their skills matrix, but I can't see anywhere, and even chatting to them, they haven't done it, of where they've actually looked at, where's our strategy say we need to be in 3 years' time, and what are the sorts of people that are going to help us get there at a governance level.
Back to you, Danica.
So future trends that are arising, I think everyone's pretty aware now of the importance of having some experience on the board with cyber, with digital, with ESG, and now with AI. These are the kind of key terms that we're seeing in the governance world, and they're becoming more and more important. So I think adding that into your skills assessment and having that in your skills matrix as directors that can bring knowledge and experience in those areas is becoming increasingly important. Again, as part of that social point, we're seeing a greater focus on diversity and inclusion, gender pay gaps, gender parity in the company, in New Zealand, Māori representation in companies and on board, anywhere really, just that diversity of thought. And then there's also just that adaptability to what's going on a global scale, what's going on in terms of technological advancements. Having those constantly on your mind when you're doing these reviews every year, and just bringing them back in or bringing them in new to your skills audit is quite important.
All right, we've got a few questions stacked up.
We've got loads of questions, and hey, I'll just a shout out to Jane Arnott. Thanks very much, Jane. You know, and it's great to have in the chat some real wisdom coming through as well. When we're talking about culture and boards and stuff, you know, recruiting to values is really, really important. We should have mentioned the values word. That, you know, if your organisation has values but your board has got different values, well, that's only going to end in tears. So thanks, Jane, for raising the values question. Indeed. George, you made a really good question there. What's the risk of identifying a current board member who has none of the desired skills? Well, I'd say, what's the risk of not identifying them? Possibly. So yes, it's a catalyst, isn't it? And maybe you, by doing this exercise, it allows for some self-reflection. But you know, when you do this and objectively the organisation or the rest of the board has come up and someone is down in that lower quartile, yeah, it's either allows self-reflection and they decide to move on, or, you know, maybe the chair has to have a tougher conversation with them. What is your view on recruiting independent non-directors to board committees? So having independents on the committees that aren't part of the board. Steve, are you a fan of that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because if you're on the board, you're on the board. It doesn't matter whether you're an elected director or whether the board has appointed you.
No, so, but you can sort of say co-opt, or you can sort of...
Well, you can co-opt, but you're still a director. I mean, the law says if you act like, look like, walk like, or treated like, then you are. It doesn't matter how you got on. So...
see this quite a bit in school boards here in New Zealand. People that don't want to join the board because they don't have the time commitment or don't want the full responsibility, but are happy to contribute their experience to a committee. And it might not be a structured subcommittee of the board. It might be more of a, you know, you might be managing property and you want someone with experience in construction and managing suppliers and contractors, but they are they're there on the committee as a committee member, but they're not a board member. So the committee reports up to the board, but it doesn't have any delegation of the board.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing in all of that is how you structure it, because if someone is attending board meetings and is participating in those board meetings, even though their focus might be on construction, then I would argue they'd probably be seen after about the third or fourth board meeting as a director. If they are task forces that the board has put together where they've got some expertise coming in to help, that's fine. That's not a problem. But you can't just call yourself a co-opted member and attend all the board meetings and not expect to be seen at law as a director. So you just need to be aware of that.
Right, we've got 5 minutes, just over 5 minutes, team. So, Simon, do you want to select a few other questions there?
Yeah, I mean, Helen raises a really good question, and we're just coming back to culture, and then I'll move on, is shouldn't board culture mirror the organisation's culture? Can you see, Stephen, ever in a situation where culture around a board table doesn't mirror that of the organisation?
I see still quite a bit of ignorance around the board table about what culture is and what the board's role in that culture is. The question we always ask is the culture of the organisation where the board requires it to be? Now that raises two issues. A, what do we require it to be? And therefore that's the values conversation that we need to have, and some sort of statement about the culture we want to see. And then the next one is, and are we being this ourselves? And unfortunately, in many instances, the board isn't, because they're either fractious or they're not living the values of the organisation. It's not hard to fix. You just have a focus on that, and then you call to account those directors who are not willing to be that. I've got one at the moment where one of the directors is actually bullying other members of the board, and they can't see it because that's just who they are. That's how they run their business. So that person needs to be taken aside and be given a few life lessons about how to work around this board table. So my view very much is that the culture is the culture of the organisation. The board has to reflect that, and we cannot expect others to be this if we're not being this ourselves.
Danica, just a quick one for you. What's the role of the company secretary in this board matrix succession planning continuum?
I think that's dependent on the different organisations and the company secretary's role. Certainly in my experience, I've facilitated the process. So I've created a survey that's gone out to the directors for self-assessment, and I've inputted that into the skills template, created the matrix and presented that at a board meeting for discussion.
Nice.
Yeah, and you should also be managing that that work plan as the company secretary as well. So knowing that that's coming up for review in the following year.
We're coming towards the end. I'm just really conscious too to remember that board appointments and the art of being a director is a human construct. And so this whole idea that you just put the skills matrix into an algorithm and it'll spit out the perfect answer is just not the way that it works. It is human, and we know that organizations are very, to use a cliche, are very dynamic, meaning that they are changing all the time. And an organization's opportunities or challenges today may be different tomorrow. So just, you use the skills matrix certainly as a guide, particularly when you are evaluating the board, particularly when you are recruiting, and particularly when you're building that pipeline of individuals and assessing, the capability set of the organization. But it's not a binary. It's not a fixed point in time. It is still very much a human endeavour.
Mm. Simon, there's a great question there from Manu, which I'd just like to briefly address, who said, some discussions today about appointments being aligned to the strategic plan. Should it be more future focused than strategic planning, which is 3 or 5 year process? Great comment, Manu. There are 3 elements to any strategy. The first one is the 30, 40, 50-year time frame. That should be encapsulated in your vision statement. So what I want to know from my directors is, are they willing to ascribe to our vision, and are they willing to use it shamelessly in everything? Are they willing to use our vision to help shape their questions, to help shape the conversations and what they engage in? The strategic plan gives us our focus for the next 3 years, and then our operational plan tells us what's happening in the next 12 months. But what I'm after from all my directors is them to actually not only understand the vision, but to use it shamelessly in absolutely everything to help shape those conversations. So great point. Thank you.
Danica, I think you'll get you to wrap up now. I think we're heading right towards 1:45.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
And thank you, Steve, for your contributions today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I think hopefully you've taken away from this what a skills matrix is and how that can help you in your succession planning. And I hope that it encourages you to go away and implement a skills matrix for your own organisation. And as Sean said, I think that template is going to be shared out to everyone. It's going to be a good starting point. Thank you to Conscious Governance for supplying that. And as always, reach out to any of us on this call if you need any help with creating or managing any of that within your organisation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danica. So feel free to connect with any of the team on LinkedIn today. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. If you'd like to be put in touch with any of them, please indicate your interest on the survey at the end of the webinar as you exit. Now, tomorrow you'll receive an email very shortly, which will include a video of today's, a recording of today's video, along with the skills matrix template. And just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our short survey so that you can go in the draw to win our gift hamper. I think that's everything. Yes, it is. So thanks again, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the session today. Thanks, Danica, for your discussion, Simon and Stephen. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar, everybody. Have a great day.